Honourable Member for Castries South.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'm once again pleased to address this Honourable House as the duly elected representative for Castries South. As usual, Mr. Speaker, it's the start of a new parliamentary year. And I want to give praise to the Almighty, my friends, families, my executive group, supporters and well-wishers. Mr. Speaker, the constituents of Castries South are becoming hopeful in the midst of suffering. It is almost 3 years since this government was elected, and soon the constituents of Castries South will be asked again to exercise their franchise. For some, it will be an opportunity to right a wrong which has haunted them since June the 6th. For others, it will be a time to reconnect with their party and restore their loyalty. And for the rest, it will be a chance to reaffirm their commitment to a party which places as a priority the lives, welfare, and prosperity of St. Lucians. Mr. Speaker, this government has failed the people of Castries South and the people of St. Lucia, and the estimates prove it once again. Mr. Speaker, the feeling that the soul of our country has been lost, that the identity of our country has been eroded, and that the moral fabric of this country has been torn apart, will soon give way to a feeling that the people really matter, that we are proud to be the custodians of our destiny, and that the prosperity of this country is not reserved to a few, characterized as family, friends, and foreigners. The constituents of Castries South are resilient and have persevered, and their time will soon come. Mr. Speaker, I am forever thankful for the love and affection which I receive from the constituents of Castries South. I am committed to providing the very best representation, ensuring that their needs are vigorously advocated and their aspirations are sufficiently voiced. I will always defend their interests, and I will be fearless, especially when holding the government to account. So, Mr. Speaker, with your permission, I address this Honourable House on the estimates of expenditure and revenue for financial year 2019-2020. And as I did last year, to focus on 4 questions. The first one, what is the social and political context within which this budget is presented? 2, are there benefits to Castries South? 3, does it pass the test for fiscal responsibility? And 4, what does the estimates tell us about the priorities of the government? I start with the social and political context. Mr. Speaker, some may not like us to repeat it, but from my standpoint in Castries South, this government has continued to be unrelenting in its divisiveness, its vindictiveness, its abuse of power, and highly irregular financial management. Mr. Speaker, as if the firing of nice workers was not wicked enough, as if the firing of professionals who headed statutory bodies was not satisfactory, as if not paying the CDP contractors was not cruel enough, as if the disrespecting of St. Lucians by calling them barking dogs and jackasses was not painful enough, we learned that public servants are seen as lazy and believe that they are entitled. These same public servants who are afraid to speak because there is a fear that they will be victimized. Mr. Speaker, as if it was not enough to discard the established practice of public tendering, to award 30 direct awards in one day, to award to the Packer Company a contract of $32 million without tender, to award a contract without tender for setting up a performance and delivery management unit for about $15 million. We would learn of a comfort letter to friends to raise $132 million. So it was called a comfort letter. If that was not bad enough, it was not signed by the Minister of Finance. Worse, the Minister of Finance would announce that monies have already been sourced for the projects involved. And did I hear that there are other such letters circulating, Mr. Speaker? Mr. Speaker, in the throne speech yesterday, the Governor General would remind us of words he uttered last year, and I quote, "Without party, parliamentary government is impossible. It is the most wonderful device that makes for peace and good government, not tribalism and warfare. Parliament is the grand inquest of the nation and in the service of our masters, the people of St. Lucia. Let us not substitute refined inquisitorial procedure for javelins of slander and knives of lies. For the sake of our children and ensuing generations, let us always rise to the occasion, government and opposition, and bring due reverence to this house. We can make St. Lucia the best of all possible words." These are telling words from the Governor General. But somehow this seems to be a schizophrenic government. The head of state says one thing, and the executive does the opposite. So, Mr. Speaker, within that context, I need to ask, within the estimates, are there any benefits to Castries South? As I did last year, Mr. Speaker, I'm hopeful that some relief can come to the constituents of Castries South. And I've searched the estimates, Mr. Speaker, and just like last year, there's only one mention of anywhere in Castries South. And it's the same Cicero rehabilitation, road rehabilitation, an allocation to meet the outstanding debts. Mr. Speaker, there are ministers who will present, and I want to put forward my case for the needs of the constituents of Castries South, Mr. Speaker. And when the various ministers speak, Mr. Speaker, I hope in some way they can address the concerns and the needs of the constituents of Castries South, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, Lower Mon Road, the issue of sidewalks and a railing for a bridge, Mr. Speaker. The railing has been done for almost 10 years, Mr. Speaker. I have been in my short time on a tour with an engineer from the Ministry of Infrastructure, Department of Infrastructure, appealing for the bridge to be rebuilt. Mr. Speaker, the old cemetery. Recently we heard a lot being said by the mayor about persons who live in the old cemetery. I'm very familiar with this area, Mr. Speaker. And I know, Mr. Speaker, the critical issues of housing in that community. The need for drains, Mr. Speaker. The need for retaining walls, Mr. Speaker. For footpaths, for lighting, and for solid waste management, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, you move on to Fuasho, another area that I'm very familiar with, Mr. Speaker. It's been years, Mr. Speaker, we've been talking about a court for the young people. Mr. Speaker, the young people would play football, cricket on the hospital road, which itself is an emergency access road to Victoria Hospital, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, drainage in Fuasho has been a perpetual problem. Previous administrations on both sides have tried to do something about it, but it continues to plague the people, Mr. Speaker. Issues of housing, of lighting, solid waste management, Mr. Speaker. There was a time under the previous administration when the drains in Fuasho were being cleaned regularly. Persons who employed full time to ensure that those drains are clean, Mr. Speaker. That has stopped since 2016, Mr. Speaker. And I believe, Mr. Speaker, because of the situation of Fuasho, those drains have to be maintained regularly, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the after-school program, and I will come to it later on, the after-school program, what I am told, has been stopped, or has stopped. It is now the recess, and they're told it's going to resume in September, Mr. Speaker. The after-school care program is important to a community like Fuasho, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, Hospital Road, footpaths, lighting, George Cooper Road, a massive retaining wall. A few years ago, there was a storm, Mr. Speaker, and serious issues to do with soil erosion, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Tunnel Road community, and I've spoken to the minister responsible for Wasco, Mr. Speaker. I've written to Wasco about the water connection for the people living there. They were living there before the Millennium Highway was built, and all of them had to connect up to the top by the Governor General's residence. Mr. Speaker, can you imagine when a pipe bursts or something is wrong, everybody has to find their way up from the bottom of Millennium Highway, through the bush, and up the steps to get to the Millennium Highway to turn off your meter. Sometimes they don't even know that the pipe has been burst. They don't even know where it is, Mr. Speaker. But yet, right in front of them, on the Millennium Highway, there runs a pipe. I've written to WASCO. A costing was done under the Labour Party, Mr. Speaker. The monies had been approved, Mr. Speaker. But of course, we know what happened. It has not been done. I have been terrorizing the minister responsible for WASCO to get this done for the people, Mr. Speaker. And I wish less work will be done in... Mr. Speaker, I hope less work will be done in Babono, and some attention will be given to the tunnel road, because this is a very serious matter, Mr. Well, cordiality has not worked, Mr. Speaker, so I have to up the ante, Mr. Speaker. But he keeps promising me he will get it done, so I will keep at him, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the land ownership, Castries South is plagued with issues of land ownership, and I will speak about that later on. But there has to be a focused attention on land ownership, Mr. Speaker. Footpaths, lighting, and drainage in that community. Mr. Speaker, there's a community called Fleet, Mr. Speaker. Some of you may not never heard of it, but it's a small community higher up the Tunnel Road community. Issues of drainage, Mr. Speaker, footpaths, lighting, road repair, Mr. Speaker. These people have been literally abandoned with the development of housing area there, Mr. Speaker. In Bannon, Mr. Speaker, issues of footpaths, lighting, land ownership against, Mr. Speaker. Anytime you pass near Bannon and you look onto the hillside, Mr. Speaker, you will see all the houses that are there, Mr. Speaker. Critical issues of land ownership. People have been living there for 30, 40 years, Mr. Speaker, and they do not own the lands, Mr. Speaker. And sometime soon, Mr. Speaker, something will have to be done about it. Mr. Speaker, I had engaged a discussion with an agency about developing the Tapio Beach, Mr. Speaker. When I grew up, Tapio Beach was where we bathed, Mr. Speaker. They didn't have any housing scheme there. It was all guava trees, Mr. Speaker, and that was the favored beach. Now there's a housing development, the Tapio Hospital is open, Mr. Speaker. And it is a beach that has to be developed to give some facilities to the young people who frequent there, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, Mon Latok, the member for Castries North is not there, but Mr. Speaker, he knows that area very well. It's been one of the areas in which he grew up, Mr. Speaker. Serious land ownership issues, the area opposite the Governor General residence, Mr. Speaker, all the way down to the Millennium Highway, Mr. Speaker. Footpaths needed on that hillside, lighting, drainage, Mr. Speaker. And only 2 weeks ago, I had a tour with an engineer from the Ministry of Infrastructure. Traffic barriers, Mr. Speaker. Vehicles coming down, Mr. Speaker, from the Governor General residence get running off the road straight into people's homes, Mr. Speaker. And it is why, Mr. Speaker, I was, whilst I welcome the barriers in the Bannon area and the waterfront, I had to remind people that this area, historically, is one of the most notorious areas, Mr. Speaker, for vehicles running off the road, Mr. Speaker. And I hope during this financial year, those barriers can be erected. Mr. Speaker, Sisera is one of the largest communities in St. Lucia. Issues of road repair, Mr. Speaker, particularly in Monkey Town, Mr. Speaker. Footpaths, drainage, Mr. Speaker. The playing field, Mr. Speaker, for a community as large as Sisera, from the top of the Mon all the way down to Monkey Town, almost 2,000 persons, Mr. Speaker. There's a playing field that can barely accommodate a 9-a-side football match. And the community is crying out for a better playing field, Mr. Speaker. Again, issues of land ownership, Mr. Speaker. And I know NHC has had a meeting in the community, and there is some discussion as to how they can reconcile some of the issues, Mr. Speaker. But there's a crying need, Mr. Speaker, for housing, for land, for people to build their houses, Mr. Speaker. Because, Mr. Speaker, when you think about it, you're born and grew up in a house with 2 rooms or maybe 3 rooms. You're 19, 20-year-old. You want to get your own space. You won't stay in your mother's plywood house anymore. You want to get out. Where do you get out? You build a shack next to your mother's house. Or you build a shack in an empty lot nearby. And the whole squatting continues, Mr. Speaker. And we have to focus on it and see what we can do about it. The community center in Sisera, Mr. Speaker, has been closed for almost 2 years, Mr. Speaker. 2 years. So there's no community center in Cicero, Mr. Speaker. And when I hear the estimates, Mr. Speaker, and how there's investment in people and communities, I have to ask, why can't something be done about a community center in Cicero? And Mr. Speaker, the issue of Wi-Fi. Cicero is one of the pilot areas for the Wi-Fi project, Mr. Speaker. And yet when it was launched, the Wi-Fi was switched off in Cicero. And other communities now have Wi-Fi, and the community that had it originally has been switched off, and on all the poles you can see all the routers, modems, and everything else, Mr. Speaker, but no Wi-Fi in the community. And I'm wondering when will GNet and whatever intranet, whatever it is, Mr. Speaker, will get to Cicero once again. The residents of Kubaril keep asking me about representation for the road to be repaired, Mr. Speaker. Another community that's historically ignored, Mr. Speaker. Woodlands, Mr. Speaker. Land ownership issues again. Individuals have been living there for, Mr. Speaker, there's one person who told me their family came there when they had the indentured servant scheme after slavery, because they came to work on the sugar estate, and the family been living upon that in that community, and they still don't own the land. It used to be owned by geese, and now a gentleman goes around collecting rent for the land, and he's probably best known now for his company name in the letter, Mr. Speaker, the notorious letter, Mr. Speaker. So, Mr. Speaker, there are serious issues of land ownership in good lands, Mr. Speaker. The playing field that the young people had established at the bottom of the hill, Mr. Speaker, was taken by this government to park container trailers, Mr. Speaker. The same area where the young people played cricket and football, they decided to put all the container trailers. And now the young people have no place for them to recreate, Mr. Speaker. Ticolo, Mr. Speaker, drainage, lighting, the road, Mr. Speaker. There's a family in Ticolo that keeps reminding me they want me to come to their home only when the rainy season starts, so I can fall trying to get down to their house because there's no drainage, there's no footpath, there's no steps, Mr. Speaker. Pastor Joseph, Mr. Speaker, I have said to the Minister of Infrastructure, Mr. Speaker, over and over about the state of the Pastor Joseph Road, Mr. Speaker. This is a road, Mr. Speaker, where the minibuses are now threatening not to pass, Mr. Speaker, because of the condition of the road. The main road in Pastor Joseph has to be a priority in this financial year, Mr. Speaker. The community in Pastor Joseph, Mr. Speaker, and that's an interesting one, Mr. Speaker. I need you to listen to this one. It was started by the former Rep. Robert Lewis, Mr. Speaker, under the CDP. The government changed, it was not continued. And all of a sudden during Christmas time, some gentlemen appeared with bags, dog food bags filled with sand and cement in it, and started to plaster it, Mr. Speaker. A contract was given to somebody to come to Pastor Joseph, not persons from the community, to come and complete or to work on the Pastor Joseph Community Center. And then when I asked who awarded the contract, which ministry, nobody can tell me. Well, I did find out who gave them the contract, but I didn't know that person was employed in any ministry. So there's somebody supervising projects in Castries South, and in Pastor Joseph in particular, who might be affiliated to CDP, because some of the people are telling me they believe these are CDP projects. So projects have been executed, Mr. Speaker. And by the way, Mr. Speaker, there are two persons executing projects in my constituency. There is one on my right, and there is one who is not here today, but is a minister of the government. Two of them.
On the right, me?
No, on the right, on that side over there, Mr. Speaker. So you have the mayor doing some projects, and you have the minister of health doing some projects. So the member from Castries is fixed of one person. I have two, Mr. Speaker. Two, Mr. Speaker. But I'm grateful for whatever they do once it improves the lives of the people, Mr. Speaker. I may not be told. I know I will not be told. But, Mr. Speaker, if it's done on the lives of the people, I improve. I will live with it. I may not agree to it, but I will live with it. So I hope they can accelerate the completion of the Pastor Joseph Community Center. We are using it in the state in which it is, and we will continue to use it. So please, whoever is giving the secret contracts, complete it. And Marigold, Mr. Speaker, the Marigold Road is shameful. And I have again spoken to the Minister with responsibility for roads, Mr. Speaker. This is a tourist attraction site, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, you really would believe by now some effort would be made to repair that road, Mr. Speaker. It is in a real state, and I'm hoping this year we can get it, Mr. Speaker. Well, I'm waiting for the good news from the Minister. Of course, Marigo playing field, I was hoping it would have been completed. From day one, I spoke to the Minister about spending the balance that is needed to complete it, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, moving on to the specifics of the estimates, Mr. Speaker. I have a particular interest in youth and sports in my constituency, Mr. Speaker, and I must ask a question, Mr. Speaker. With the Don Lockerbie Parker Company contract, what has become of sports services, Mr. Speaker? Mr. Speaker, if you look at page 495, it's really a sad statement, Mr. Speaker. There are no monies for elite athletes assistance and talent, Mr. Speaker. There's no money for maintenance of playing fields, Mr. Speaker. There's no money for sports equipment, Mr. Speaker. And there's no money for national coaching programs, Mr. Speaker. And you really have to ask the question, what is happening, Mr. Speaker? $32 million was paid to a company which did not even have, Mr. Speaker, a sports design and construction component. Do you know, Mr. Speaker, how the Parker Company is described on its website? It's described as the world's premier fittings, furniture, and equipment purchasing firm for the global hospitality industry since 1969. That's how it's described. And they got a contract to design sporting infrastructure in St. Lucia, the world's premier FF&E purchasing firm for the global hospitality industry, Mr. Speaker. And they got that without tender again, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, page 495 states that only $20.6 million will be spent on construction of sporting facilities by Don Lockerbie and the Parker Company. The contract was for $32 million. So I assume at least $12 million will go into consultancy fees and project management. If it's only $20 million will be spent on construction. Now, Mr. Speaker, architectural engineering fees usually 5% of the project amount. Project management fees usually 2%. So legitimately you would have expected about 7% would have been spent toward the consulting firm. In this case, almost more than 33% was allocated to the company. And also, Mr. Speaker, on page 495, you will notice that in addition to the $42 million contract which was given to the Parker Company, the government of St. Lucia now has to pay $300,000 in salaries for the same project. Now think about it, Mr. Speaker. We've signed a contract to pay $32 million to a company to do all those works, design and construct sporting facilities. Why does the government of St. Lucia still have to find $300,000 to pay salaries? Salaries for who? To do what? Couldn't that $300,000 be spent on buying sports equipment for schools, for communities, to spend on national talent development, Mr. Speaker? Why, in addition to $32 million, we have to spend another $300,000 in salaries? And Mr. Speaker, I have said during the debate in this House on the loan for the Don Lockerbie Parker Company contract that the construction of artificial turf to replace our natural turf is not a good idea. It may look good to bluff young people, to make them believe that they are modern, that they have artificial turf to play on, but anybody who knows about sports, and I will tell you, Mr. Speaker, I know some of the persons involved in this government in sports, and I know they know better. I've not spoken to them about it. But deep down inside, anybody who knows about sports would never agree to this. Because if I ask each of them and say to them, I'm giving you $42 million to spend on sports development in the country, how would you spend it? They would never have come up with this plan. You know what they would do, Mr. Speaker? They would spend it on national development programs. They would spend it on support for athletes. They would spend it on having the best competitions in St. Lucia. That's what they would spend it on. Of course, they would probably also spend it on upgrading playing fields, like Cicero playing fields, a court for Fouacho, a court for Basse Joseph, a field for Goodlands. They would do all those things, Mr. Speaker. But most of that money, they would spend it in the direct development of the athletes. because they know artificial turf and having 400-meter tracks in every community. I even heard the member from Babono saying he'll build a 400-meter track in Bogis too. I guess that's in the next phase. So just now, every community will have 400-meter tracks, we'll have artificial turf, but we'll have no money for development programs, no money for talent identification, no money for elite athlete development. And that's what has happened as a result of this. So you might bluff the young people and mama guide them into believing that this government is all about you, we're building artificial turf for you. But deep down inside, Mr. Speaker, that's not how we develop athletes and sporting talent, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Constituency Development Program, there's a decline, Mr. Speaker, from $18.6 million to $10.6 million. I'm not sure why, Mr. Speaker, but I recall the minister at the beginning of the term of this government saying that the monies for the CDP will now be shifted more to provide training in communities. I don't know if you remember that, Mr. Speaker, when all the talk was going around about CHTTI and those programs, Mr. Speaker, that money would move from infrastructural projects to training in communities. After all what I have said about the various communities, Mr. Speaker, I think there is still a need for the CDP to be used to improve the physical conditions of persons in St. Lucia, and in particular the urban areas, Mr. Speaker. There is still a crying need, Mr. Speaker, for infrastructural development at the community level. And I want to appeal to the Minister, Mr. Speaker, to ensure that monies under the CDP can be used, Mr. Speaker, to improve Fuasho Cemetery and all those communities that I mentioned, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I note on page 356 an allocation for the PROUD program, although it's about $4.6 million less, Mr. Speaker. As I stated earlier, Mr. Speaker, the old cemetery needs a PROUD program, Banner needs a PROUD program, Monlatok needs a PROUD program, Woodlands need a PROUD program, Mr. Speaker. And I'm looking forward to the day when such will be done for the constituents in those areas. Mr. Speaker, the member from Grozile spoke about the aftercare program, and that it had increased from $340,000 to $403,000. That's on page 380, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, that increase is not enough, Mr. Speaker. More communities have been brought into the after-school program. There has to be a larger increase than this, Mr. Speaker. And I repeat, Mr. Speaker, I support this program. It is a crucial program for communities like Fuasho and Cicero, Mr. Speaker. And therefore, I want to appeal, Mr. Speaker, for greater effort and allocation for this program, Mr. Speaker. I heard a member from Grozile, and I think that's what I heard, I'm not sure, saying that there is no allocation for the summer stimulus for Christmas and whatnot. But as far as going through the estimates, I think there is, Mr. Speaker. I noticed, Mr. Speaker, very curiously, Mr. Speaker, and you may wish, Mr. Speaker, for there to be an explanation. Under the section Grants and Contributions, under his ministry, under the Honourable Member's ministry, Mr. Speaker, the agency is not mentioned, Mr. Speaker, but program heads are mentioned. So mention, and I'm not sure what page it is, Mr. Speaker. The programs are mentioned as against the agencies. So SSDF would receive transfers, Mr. Speaker, page 546, Mr. Speaker. So you will see headings, Mr. Speaker, rather than the agency the money is being transferred to. And Mr. Speaker, the minister has already spoken, but there's a heading called Other Social Assistance Projects. An allocation of $1.5 million is provided. And I need to ask the question, Mr. Speaker, who is this money for? For what purpose? Is there a policy guiding its use? Because for the allocation to have a broad heading saying other social assistance projects, Mr. Speaker, I think it's inadequate for the estimates, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'm glad to hear the minister mention that the Youth Empowerment for Life project continues. It is a project that I support. The Youth Empowerment project for me, Mr. Speaker, can make a significant impact on the lives of young people, especially in the urban areas. But I was very disappointed, Mr. Speaker, when I called looking for assistance for a couple of young men from Cicero who wanted to start a small farm. They were trying to go the right way, do things the right way, Mr. Speaker. And I was told that it does not apply to Castries South, that it is only for certain communities, you know, Mr. Speaker. And I was shocked to hear it, Mr. Speaker. And I would really love to hear which communities in St. Lucia qualify for assistance under the Youth Empowerment for Life project, Mr. Speaker. Because I would hate to believe that not only is this not a national project, but only some communities in Castries are the ones to benefit. And Mr. Speaker, these days where you have to say the city of Castries separate from the district of Castries South. Because with the new bill that was passed, Castries South is now a district on its own. And there's now the city of Castries. And it looks like only the city of Castries, or communities in the city of Castries that benefit from youth employment projects. So I'm saying to the minister, if there's any way he can expand the beneficiaries of that project to include Fuasho, includes Monkey Tongue, Cicero, Mr. Speaker, that would be a most welcome addition, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the minister also spoke about the BNTF 9th program, Mr. Speaker. And I'm glad to hear that the allocation this year has increased. And I'm glad to hear that he's going to focus on the implementation of the program, Mr. Speaker. Because I have an interest in this program. He didn't give a lot of details, but when the last program was ending, Mr. Speaker, some roads in Goodlands had commenced, Mr. Speaker. And as far as I was made to understand, under the next program, the roads would have continued, because quite a few persons deep inside Woodlands have no access to their homes, and under the CDP BNTF 9th program, assistance was provided and will be continued under the 9th program. So the minister has spoken, but I'm hoping, Mr. Speaker, that at some point he can indicate to me that yes, in fact, the roads in Woodlands will be continued. Mr. Speaker, can you indicate to me how much more time I have? 45 minutes, Mr. Speaker? Okay, Mr. Speaker. The third question I want to ask, Mr. Speaker, and I really need you, Mr. Speaker, to, follow me with this one, Mr. Speaker. I need to ask the question, is this a deficit budget, and does it pass the test for fiscal responsibility, Mr. Speaker? Mr. Speaker, for the last two budgets, I've reminded the people of St. Lucia that this government, when in opposition, promised it would stop borrowing. Furthermore, Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister stated that government must be run like a business with himself as the CEO. So on every occasion, Mr. Speaker, we must judge the figures presented by the CEO to see whether or not the business is doing well.
They should be fired.
But Mr. Speaker, I must tell you that the figures in this year's budget, Mr. Speaker, have confused me, Mr. Speaker. This is a budget like no other budget, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this one has confused me, Mr. Speaker. And you would notice today, Mr. Speaker, the Ministry of Finance circulated a document correcting some of the figures, Mr. Speaker. And before I spoke today, I wanted to just comment to a few persons and raise it in the Ministry of Finance that I was seeing figures in here that are so obviously wrong, Mr. Speaker. Now, Mr. Speaker, I'm not raising that in any effort to show any, fault on the part of the technical people. And I want to be very cautious, and I want them to understand that. But I have to raise it, Mr. Speaker. I used to be a permanent secretary myself, Mr. Speaker. And, I understand sometimes how the figures can get sometimes, mixed up, Mr. Speaker. But some of those figures are so obviously wrong, Mr. Speaker, at least from my understanding, Mr. Speaker. Now, maybe I have an obligation to point it out, Mr. Speaker, and for corrections to be made or clarification provided to me, Mr. Speaker. Because we are told, Mr. Speaker, a new chart of accounts have been implemented. I would have hoped that somebody would have tried to explain this new chart of accounts to us and how it really works, Mr. Speaker. Secondly, Mr. Speaker, one of the changes in the new chart of accounts is that you've been told before you were accustomed with capital projects, and a capital project included all the components of the project. But now, salaries and wages are being moved to recurrent expenditure. So now capital projects, and they call project spending, is now building and infrastructure and another line item. So there is a change. So a lot of the wages and salaries that would fall under capital spending are now under recurrent. Now I would want to assume, Mr. Speaker, that all the figures in here, all the summary pages in here, Mr. Speaker, would have been regularized. Regularized meaning everything in there is now under the new system. So when I compare one year to the next year, I'm comparing apples with apples and not apples with oranges. Otherwise, you cannot make comparisons, Mr. Speaker. Otherwise, you cannot. So I need you to go through this exercise with me, Mr. Speaker, and bear me out on it, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, let's start off with page 4. And I'm not going to speak about the revenue figures, Mr. Speaker. The revenue figures on page 4, and I'm talking about the non-tax, tax, and sale of assets. They kind of correspond, Mr. Speaker, with what's on page 3. There was a problem, as you can note, Mr. Speaker, in the year 2017-2018. If you look at your estimates, the year 2017-2018 are different to the year 2017-2018 on page 4. But a document was circulated correcting those figures. So they now, I don't know if you have a copy of the document, Mr. Speaker. There was a document circulated by the Ministry of Finance earlier today, correcting some of those figures. But even in correcting it, Mr. Speaker, there are a lot that were not corrected. And I don't know, Mr. Speaker, do you have a copy of this document? They were put on our desk, everybody got an envelope with it. So, let's go for it, Mr. Speaker. The total expenditure for 2017-2018, Mr. Speaker, shows 1,395,518,602, Mr. Speaker, and that corresponds with what's on page 3. Mr. Speaker, the total expenditure for approved estimates for 2018-2019 shows 1.48 billion. Yes, Mr. Speaker, you following me? That's on page 4. If you look for approved estimates 2018-2019, 1,487,583,200. And if you look on page 3, you will see the same figures for total expenditure, yeah? But if you look, Mr. Speaker, for the revised estimates for 2018-2019, you will see the same figure. Now, that has been corrected in the new document. But just imagine, Mr. Speaker, for 3 instances, the same total exists, but all the item heads are different in every instance, but the total always adds up to the same. You following me? So imagine you have a global total, but each case the line item is different, but it always adds up to the same total. But the Ministry of Finance has corrected it with the document they circulated. So the grand